Hey everybody, welcome back to Let's Roll, and today I wanted to talk about D&D. So, dungeon crawls, fairly straightforward thing, concept-wise. Basically, the dungeon crawl is meant for whenever you and your party, believe it or not, go into a dungeon, and you basically have the DM describe the room, the environment to you, give you your options of, specific items that might be of interest, stuff like that, whatever you guys want to play around with. They describe what happens when you do and how you do it. And then, just like every dungeon, there's probably a room that leads off into another area. And then whenever you get to that next area, you continue with the descriptions, and that's for the player side. The DM side, however, is a bit different. The DM, of course, is still describing everything to the players, but at the same time, the DM is also keeping track of a couple things during this dungeon crawl. The DM keeps track of time, because time is a big factor in dungeons. Basically, time helps you keep track of torches that the players might be using to get the benefits of color vision instead of just dark vision, which I'm going to have a whole separate video on that. So if you have trouble with dark vision, I will have a video for that, and keep an eye out for it. But time also helps the dungeon master decide where monsters are at any given time, because in dungeons, monsters don't just spawn in whenever you open a door to a room. They are pre-filled with those monsters, and those monsters have jobs, probably, depending on what kind of monsters they are. Don't know what kind of job a zombie is going to be doing, but they could do menial tasks, I guess. Anyways, the monsters can roam. They can fulfill their tasks, and the boss at the end of the dungeon may have a goal that they're trying to achieve while the party is in the dungeon exploring it. So, and then, that last part, it helps them keep track of the boss's goals. Because it could be, if you guys don't, the DM wouldn't tell you exactly unless it was a story point in the adventure. Say you guys have 30 minutes to clear out a dungeon and get to the boss and kill him before he teleports away or explodes the entire world. Who knows? Anyways, so that's what the DM is also doing while the players explore the rest of the dungeon. So that's the main gist of a dungeon crawl. So there's a lot of videos about dungeon crawls, and there's a few videos, for example, by a person called Mystic Arts on YouTube, and he does a great explanation of dungeon crawls and many various topics about them. His latest one was about the choices that a DM should be providing for players in a dungeon crawl, and I think it's a great video and you should go check that out. However, I had a few points about dungeon crawls that I wanted to bring up, and so let's just get straight to it. So, the first thing I wanted to bring up is that D&D, as a game itself, is kind of built around dungeon crawls. The reason I say that is because it is the most condensed version of D&D that can be ran as a one-shot or a long campaign. And what I mean by that is, by condensed, I mean whenever a party enters a room, it's easy to keep track of what's going on in one room. And then for the rest of the dungeon, it's easy to keep track of, for the DM, it's easy to keep track of what is going on in the surrounding rooms and where the monsters in those surrounding rooms would be. For example, you might have adventure like, I'll bring it up again, Dragon of Icespire Peak. This will not be the last time that I bring this adventure up as an example in this video. Dragon of Icespire Peak takes place in the region around Neverwinter in Phandalin. Or the I guess it's called the Phandelver area. I don't know. Anyways, so it's a decent sized region. I'm not going to count how many hexes, 5-mile hexes there are in it, but the map is pretty big. It is hard to keep track of everything that could be happening in every area of that massive region. Whereas, whenever you condense it down to a dungeon that's, I mean, you can have a big dungeon, but that big dungeon's still not the size of an entire region, right? So it's a lot easier to keep track of time, it's a lot easier to keep track of where and why monsters are where they are, and it's a lot easier to keep track of the players as well. The players actually benefit a little bit from dungeon crawls as well, from the fact that they have more direction as to where they're going. You taking pictures? Oh, how should I put it? So, if you describe a region to a party of characters and you tell them, okay, yeah, you're in a wide open field and you can go anywhere you want to go, you have a whole 360 degrees of direction that you can go. You're like, okay, what do I see this way? What do I see that way? What do I see this way? A dungeon, the dungeon master describes the dungeon in the greatest detail that they want to go into, and then you tell them the directions that they can go. Hey, there's a exit that way. There's an exit that way. And then there might be a couple secret exits or secret rooms. And a party can look for them easily because you can define how many walls are in a dungeon's room. I think that makes a lot of sense. So, with that, I think also, one other thing. It's a lot easier for combat. It's a lot easier to keep track of combat inside a dungeon. Have you ever had combat in an open arena or an open environment and just went, this is a lot to keep track of, because the open environment may have, I don't know, 20 monsters and then 5 party members to keep track of? Okay, so every other fight that we've done, other than in the Shrine of Savras and the Dragon of Icespire Peak, every other fight has been a theater of the mind fight. And usually what it ends up becoming, even if in the beginning I give out great description of what's really happening and where everything is, it ends up at the end becoming, okay, I'm going to move to this monster and I'm going to hit him. And you're like, okay, but where is that monster? And you end up really not caring because you want the combat to flow. And so, in a dungeon, you can do theater of the mind way easier because you can tell it's easy for a dungeon master to tell you, okay, this monster came in through the exit that's 40 feet away from the exit that you guys are standing at. So, you know, you're giving out more description of where everything is. And that provides you and the party a lot more of an idea as to, okay, what can I do? And you kind of can like see that, you can perceive it in your mind, you know, versus a big wide open area. You're like, okay, this is all liminal gray space and there's a monster over there, you know? So that's where I'm going to leave combat for this, because I'm going to get way too far into it and then I'm going to forget where I'm going with this. So the next point that I wanted to bring up was story structure. Dungeons provide a great scenario for a dungeon master to be able to tell a story, because dungeons can be multiple choice and they can be wide and expansive, but dungeons provide a linear-ish environment for a party to go down. In other words, you're going to end up at the end of this dungeon, more than likely. Whether or not it takes multiple days, or whether or not it takes 5 minutes. You're going to end up at the end of this dungeon, and there is going to be something there. There is going to be a story told, not only while you're going through the dungeon, making the story of your adventure, but also the history of the dungeon and the mystery of what's really happening here. So, in that way, dungeons are an incredible structure for story. Next thing I wanted to get into was more for the DMs. Provide cool reasons for your players to get hooked into wanting to go into your early dungeons. Because here's a little trick. You hook your players into going into those early dungeons and they find it to be cool, they're going to want to go into the later dungeons without you needing to hook into them at all. Obviously, if you let that play on for an indefinite amount of time, eventually they're going to be like, okay, there's nothing really cool here, and then they're going to fall off. But if you get those early dungeons established as, hey, these are cool, you should go into them, and then you provide them with some cool stuff, the party is going to see a dungeon off in the distance. And you don't even have to describe anything to them. You just tell them, yeah, you see a temple over there. They're going to be like, I'm going to go explore that because every other dungeon has been cool, so why wouldn't we go through this dungeon? So once you've hooked your players into your early dungeons and they start going into your other dungeons without needing a good hook to go into them, allow mystery to fill your dungeons. Don't give out everything that a dungeon holds within the dungeon. Whenever you're out in the open world, allow the world to explore the history of that dungeon. Allow a library to carry books about the area and maybe why the dungeon could have been built. Allow the history of a dungeon to be a mystery for the party to solve, not only while they're in the dungeon, but also in the outer world. Basically what I'm saying. You know what I mean? I think you know what I mean. I find that a lot of dungeons, whenever you go into them, you come out pretty much knowing everything about the dungeon. There's one, for example, in Dragon by Spire Peak. There is a dragon barrel, and I changed it around a little bit, but by the time you come out of that dungeon, you know pretty much everything about the dungeon. You know that it's built because there was an ancient fight that happened between a noble and a dragon, and the noble killed the dragon, and they both died, and the noble was buried in the dragon barrel with the dragon. It's a cool dungeon, but it would be also cool if you could figure out more of that history outside of that dungeon. And you probably can, I mean, as a DM, you can change that around as much as you want, but as written, that's kind of just how it is, you know? Going on to my next point, make your dungeons dangerous, because nobody wants to... Actually, you know what? There's one point I want to make. Make your dungeons dangerous, unless there's a reason why the dungeons... Make your dungeons dangerous, unless there's a reason why your dungeon ain't dangerous. So, if you have an abandoned dungeon, obviously you need some really cool stuff for why the party wants to go in there. However, just for a normal dungeon, make your dungeons dangerous, man. Monsters, unless given reason, should be reasonably themed. But some groups can coexist with others. So, a goblin cave. You're not going to have a goblin... you're not going to have goblins working with... You're probably not going to have goblins working with mind flayers unless it's like Baldur's Gate 3, where for some reason the goblins and the mind flayers are able to coexist with each other. They give reasonable cause for why the goblins would work with the mind flayers and vice versa. However, just for like a normal dungeon, zombies probably ain't going to be the best group to partner with goblins. Let's see, trying to think of something else. A lich probably won't be able to coexist with a dragon. An owlbear probably will be too territorial for a group of drow, for example. So I feel like some of this may be some obvious dungeon advice, but sometimes, you just need to work on the basics. The next thing I wanted to talk about was using traps. If your dungeon has a lot of monsters, use traps sparingly, and vice versa. If you have a lot of traps, use monsters sparingly. It doesn't make any sense for a goblin cave to be trapped to the point where if the goblins were to take one step, they would die. And it also wouldn't make any sense for a dungeon with a ton of traps to be occupied by a lot of monsters. So, unless given reason, goblins aren't going to trap their entrance to their cave with a flamethrower that can be triggered just by walking through the entrance. Because if the goblins needed to leave the cave, they wouldn't be able to, or else they would become barbecue. The only case where this might make sense is if you have a undead crypt and that was trapped. But the next point kind of plays into that. If you have traps in your dungeon, first of all, place them in a way that makes sense. And second of all, use triggered traps to indicate to your players that there are traps there. Sometimes you want to surprise them, that's fine. But triggered traps for like an extremely deadly trap can be used to notify your players that there is something aloof. There is something going on in this room. And if they're not careful, they will die. Perfect example is the Goblin Cave. If you have traps in a Goblin Cave and one of the goblins decides during combat, "Oh, I need to leave because we are all about to die," and he runs away, and in his mind he just forgets that there's a trap down the hallway. He runs through the trap and a log comes down and collapses his chest in, and then he dies. That's a good way of telling your party, hey, there are traps here and you can die from them. The next point I wanted to get into was environmental hazards that coincide with the monsters that fill the dungeon. Of course, you should use environmental hazards. I think that kind of goes without saying. I find that a lot of the dungeons, every dungeon in Dragon of Spire Peak has no environmental hazards, and it makes me sad. Because I think environmental hazards provide that little bit of extra flavor to the dungeon that monsters don't, where it's like, oh yeah, other things other than monsters can be dangerous in this world. And yellow mold, for example, can coincide with undead. See, that's the thing. You can theme environmental hazards with different types of creatures, and that's cool. And you can even make multiple types of creatures coincide with one environmental hazard, so then the party's thinking, oh boy, which one is this? Is the green slime a cause of an aberration, or is it the cause of an ooze? That's how you provide tension, people. Create tension with environmental hazards. The DM's guide gives you all kinds of examples for environmental hazards that you should use. There's another one, Inferno. They can be devils or demons. Use it, please. It will provide you with that little flavor. It'll be like the scene from Ratatouille for all of your players whenever they go step into the dungeon and they see Inferno. And then that could they think, oh, this could coincide with demons or devils. It's like that scene whenever he eats Ratatouille and he thinks back to his childhood whenever he was as creative as their dungeon master. Alright, so the next point about dungeons that I wanted to make was using supernatural gifts or supernatural boons. So, wait, I said that wrong. Use supernatural boons or supernatural wanes. Banes, wanes, I don't know I forget which word they use in the Dungeon Master's Guide. It's literally right over there, but I'm too lazy to go get it. Anyways, you know what I mean. Use supernatural gifts as a boost to your party if they're feeling like they can't go on and you want them to just push themselves into the next room because there's something cool in the next room and you want them to see it really bad. So give them something, a little bit of extra oomph for them to feel confident enough to go, yeah, I'll go in there. Why not? We ball, right? And then on the opposite side of the same coin, use a bane or a wane, whatever it's called, to slow them down a little bit. Maybe one of the evil gods don't want them to get to the end of this dungeon, and that can be a story beat too. That can be an awesome story beat, actually. The further you go into a dungeon, the more the god bestows curses on you and gives you banes in order to try to stop your party, but your party's just so determined to go through this that nothing can stop them, you know, kind of showing the spirit of an adventuring party a little bit. So use that. At the same time, allow your party to retreat if they need to. A lot of people want to say that as a party, you should not be able to rest in a dungeon or rest even in the area outside of a dungeon because it's so dangerous. I, however, say that if the players can create a scenario where it would be plausible for them to sleep through the night and not get killed in the middle of their sleep, go right for it. I allow it. Why? Because it allows them to carry on through the dungeon. There's one thing I wanted to bring up about Oblivion in this video, because I have a whole separate video also planned for Oblivion, and the fact that Oblivion has a lot of things that I think we could use as Dungeon Masters to enhance our D&D games. So, have you ever played Oblivion and realized that in the middle of a dungeon, you all of a sudden have the ability to level up and there is no place to rest for you to level up? Yes, there is. A lot of the dungeons in Oblivion have beds either inside the dungeon or outside of the dungeon, and I get it. D&D's not a video game, but it's still a game. So, the story, what was I about to say? The lesson to be had from Oblivion is if you provide your characters or your players with a reasonable way to rest, let them, because that gives them more incentive to go to your dungeons, and that gives them more incentive to play through the entire dungeon. Whereas with a dungeon master that, say, wouldn't do that, the party would be like, okay, well, we're really low on resources here. Guess we need to leave, go to the nearest town, rest, and then come back, and it just takes up a lot of time. Whereas you could just allow them to create a scenario in which they could rest outside the dungeon or inside the dungeon, and then continue on their way at the end of the rest. Now, this does not mean that you have to go easy on them, because there are obviously time constraints in some dungeons, and if they rest and the time constraint is met, you should obviously have the time constraint become a problem. So, keep that in mind. I'm not saying go easy on them. I'm saying they'll allow them to create scenarios for themselves in which they could become rested. My next point is, in a dungeon, what is the one room that everybody wants to get to? the last room of the dungeon. You want to know why? Because the last room of a dungeon always means that there's treasure at the end of that room. After the boss fight, usually. People, why do we only let it be the one room in the dungeon that has all the treasure? Separate the treasure into different themes like the Dungeon Master Guide says. Implements, armaments, arcana, relics. Those 4 kinds of treasure are more than enough to spread throughout an entire dungeon. If you're going to have branching pathways in a dungeon, spread out the treasure. Don't let it all be in one room, because there's no point in exploring the rest of the dungeon if it don't have any treasure. So spread it out, let your party find out where the treasure is, and if they miss something, then that's a perfect cause for another adventuring party to come into the dungeon, find that branch, and go, hey, there's treasure over here. But obviously the rest of the treasure is gone because the previous party took all the other treasure. But they still found something, you know, that's cool. We like that. Yeah, and of course, the last room of a dungeon can have more than the rest of the dungeon. But yeah, that's fine. Like, obviously, you want more of a reward for going into the entire dungeon, but spread it out a little bit. Spread the love to tell stories, to tell the stories of the rest of your dungeon. And the last point I wanted to make was dungeons can have NPCs or even civilizations inside of them. This is more for mega dungeons. However, you can do it with small dungeons too. This is a lesson from a game called Barony. And if you haven't played Barony, go play it right now because it is very fun. But the lesson to be had from Barony is that NPCs can be in dungeons. The whole point of the game is a dungeon crawl. However, you can find previous adventuring parties that have either been slain or their previous party was split, and you can recruit them into your party, and they'll help you out through the rest of the dungeon. There are merchants that will buy and sell and barter with you all the stuff that you're able to loot off the other creatures, and all the stuff that you've looted from chests and treasure and stuff like that. And they will give you, and they're all themed merchants too, so you're not buying, you know, everything from one merchant. You have to go through multiple levels of the dungeon in order to get the different types of merchants. The last part is there are entire towns inside the dungeon. There are whole groups of people that will like provide you with their services inside these towns. In Barony, it's mostly just multiple merchants, but obviously, you know, you can have a whole variety of NPCs in a civilization underneath a dungeon. I won't go too far into examples, but you can have a trainer. You can have someone that maybe, I don't know. Obviously, merchants are like the #1 thing, but oh, maybe you can hire a mercenary group to go into the next layer of the dungeon and maybe take off a little bit of the load of the next layer of the dungeon for you. You know, stuff like that. They come back, they're like, hey, we killed a few monsters. There's probably a couple more in there, but for the most part, the next area is ready for you to loot. Perfect. Great. Awesome. Yeah. NPCs and civilizations inside dungeons, use them, especially for the mega dungeons, because eventually the players are going to get tired of combat only, and also the same with puzzles. They're going to get tired of puzzles too. Eventually they're going to want to talk to somebody, and if those people aren't inside the dungeon, they're going to go out of the dungeon in order to get that roleplay. And if you don't want them out of the dungeon, then make the dungeon keep them in. Yeah, take your players hostage, put them in a dungeon, keep them in the dungeon, torture them for the rest of eternity. Anyways, guys, I'm gonna get started on editing this video now, and well, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, let's roll.